We want to really talk about just a little bit more about these consequences. And one of the things I always like to do with firefighters when we start talking about these principles is then kind of bring it all together and look at, for example, a fire incident. Okay, what happens during a fire incident relative to the things that we're talking about? So if we kind of look at this in two ways here, the work condition, in other words, what we're doing, and the physiological consequences of that. And the physiological consequence we're talking about here is specific to heat stress and dehydration. Did you want to talk? Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, all we're going to do is we're going to start rotating. So he's going to talk, keep listening. Okay, you two go back, get your food. 5,000 calories a day at least. Okay, we're going to talk about that in a little bit. You got food. So go back there. There's plenty. Get what you want. So when you two are done, back, the next two go. Everybody be quiet so he can keep going. You can hear him. Okay. All right.
Okay, so let's talk about dispatch, the trip to the fire, and arrival on scene. What's going on here? Even before you get to the scene, you're going to have some anticipation, some sympathetic drive. This is something that in a study a few years ago here in Indianapolis, we did a lot of extensive physiology monitoring on fire shifts. And we monitored respiratory and cardiovascular physiology on guys throughout their shift. Every shift for 6 months, 56 different firefighters. And so we saw the alarm wake them up, what their heart rate response, what their respiratory response were to those kind of things, what the physical work was that they did. And so what we saw was that, as soon as that alarm rings, there's an outflow of sympathetic nervous system drive, and that stuff starts your heart rate moving. Get your heart rate going, get your respiratory stuff going. Even when you're sitting in the truck on the way to the fire, you're going to have some of this going on. Okay? And we know that as a response to that, your heart rate's going to go up, your metabolic rate's going to start up, but we're not really doing a lot of heavy work compared to what we're doing on the scene, and we're not yet in our turnout gear and in that uncompensable heat stress environment. So we're okay with that respect, but we're already starting down that road where we're cranking things up. We're beginning to increase metabolism, increase heat production, increasing sweat rate, those kind of things. When you get to the scene, you don your gear, you get into that uncompensable heat stress environment, and the work begins, okay? All these things start up. Heart rate and blood pressure start going up quickly. Metabolic activity goes up really quickly. Sweating begins to increase quickly. And within about 5 minutes, or even less, of continued work, now your sweating rate's up there close to its maximum ability, and your water loss has become drastic. Okay? Core rise, and then you get into that drastic cycle here. Increased heart rate, increased core temperature, increased sweat rate. Things just keep feeding on themselves. You have this, heavy work is continuing, but you're also maintaining that inability to compensate for the heat that's being generated. Again, heavy work, uncompensable heat stress environment means that a lack of ability to compensate for the heat that's being produced, and all these things are a consequence to that, and this is one of the things that we begin to see. Your ability to physically do work begins to diminish. Now, I'm not a psychologist, and I won't talk to you about psychology other than to say this. We know, and I know from literature, not from experience, that when this happens, your cognitive function diminishes also, or it can. Okay? It's a little easier to maintain if you know what to do and you've trained and you've been taught how to deal with these situations. Your cognitive function doesn't have to diminish to the point that your life's in danger. Again, that's what these guys are going to teach you this week. That's what you're here for. Now, normally, we get there, we start working, we work, we kill the fire, we do our overhaul, we're done, we get out. Work stops. We get out of that heat stress environment, okay? What happens? Well, we start to recover. This is where we go to rehab, okay? Effective sweating begins. Sweating doesn't begin. You've been sweating this whole time, but now the sweat that you're actually generating has the ability, hopefully, to evaporate and cause heat loss. Unfortunately, at this point, you've lost so much water that your ability to sweat may be drastically diminished. Okay? That is, how many of you are medics? Okay? What do we call that? When you start to lose the ability to sweat, what's that a symptom of? Heat stroke, heat shock. Okay? What's going on? Well, here's the problem. You got this big brain sitting up here on your noggin, and it's very selfish. It must have blood flow. It must have, you must maintain blood pressure to keep blood flow going to your brain. And your brain is willing to share to allow your rest of your body to cool itself as long as it's getting what it needs. It's kind of like my ex-wife. Okay? But as soon as things start to get compromised here, the brain says, that's it, I'm shutting you down. And it stops blood flow to the skin. If you don't have any blood flow to the skin tissue, you're not sweating. What happens to the skin? Mr. Medic, what happens to the skin? Cold, clammy. Somebody that's hotter than hell outside, they've been working this environment, and you touch them, they feel cool and dry. No, the reason they feel cool and dry is because blood flow has stopped to the skin. Their blood volume has reduced so much that the brain has shut blood flow off to the skin, and you're not cooling anything now. That person's in real jeopardy. Okay? Because if you don't get them cooled off quickly, they're going to die. Okay? They're going to slip into a heat stroke, and okay, they've already started that process. Okay? Hopefully here, you're still moving around and you're still conscious enough that we can rehydrate you. You can begin the rehydration process. So if everything goes the way we want it to, this is the process. Okay? You are not going to prevent yourself from dehydrating on a fire. It's not possible. Even if you just go there and you're the RIT team and you're standing outside in your turnout gear, guess what? You're dehydrating because you're in that uncompensable heat stress environment. Your body simply cannot cool itself. Okay? So just because you may be third engine and you're the RIT team and you go to a fire on a hot day and you stand around in under the shade tree in your turnout gear and you go back to the house and think, I don't need to rehydrate. I didn't do anything to that fire. What happens at the next fire an hour later when now you're first due? That next fire, you're starting in a dehydrated condition when you get there, and now you've compromised yourself and put your life in jeopardy. So, we kind of think, and this is one of the things that I see in the fire service, and I understand the logic of this, is that you segment your thinking in terms of what have I got to do on this fire, okay? If I go to this fire, if I go to a fire, I've got to do this, 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 and this, and then we're done. I'm not come back to the house. And that's when you stop thinking about it. But as soon as that fire's over and you get right here, you better start thinking about the next fire. Even though you don't know when it's going to be, you better start thinking about the next one and getting yourself prepared properly for the next one. The worst thing that can possibly happen is that you get right here and you start your rehydration process, you get on your apparatus and you start back to the station. Maybe you changed your bottles out, you mark back in service, and before you get back to the house, you get another fire. Why is that a problem? Because you have not properly recovered from the first one yet. And that happens. It happens a lot. Here in Indianapolis, last summer, I talked about that hot spell we had. And I know most of you guys are from central Indiana, this area, so you all had the same experience in terms of the heat. And I worked out of 10s and 22s and that area over there on the east side. And when that hot spell was going on, I went and stayed at the fire station for like a week. Because normally when I go to a fire, I don't do much. I just stand around and, you know, get in the chief's way and get yelled at and, you know, act like I know what I'm doing. But what I'm really trying to do is learn, okay? But on those fires, when there is a need for a more organized rehabilitation program, a multi-alarm fire in a very hot condition on an apartment fire or something like that, then it's a different story, because when they dispatch that medical officer to supervise rehab, then I get called into duty too. I get paged for those fires. I go to those fires. I help run rehab and that kind of thing. It's the only active role that I actually ever take in firefighting on the scene, okay, is that I try to help that medical officer supervise those things. Make sure everything's happening the way it should. And this is also one of the ways that we figure out where our weaknesses are and how we need to improve. But one of the things that we saw at TANS last year was we went, one particular day we went at 7:30 in the morning, we had a 2-alarm apartment fire. 7:30 in the morning, it's already like 90 degrees outside and the heat index is like a 95 or 96. So we go to the fire, it's already hot, humid conditions, and everybody's kind of saying, hey, I'm glad this fire happened now and not later. So we went to the fire, they did their work, they were first due, the truck and the ladder and the squad all worked their asses off, they got dehydrated, they started this they went through this process, they got back in the apparatus, they went back. At 11:30, guess what? Another fire. Another multi-alarm apartment fire where they were first due. None of those guys were they were working on it. They were trying to rehydrate. They were trying to do the things that they needed to do, but they'd only been back in the house for an hour and a half or 2 hours, and that was not sufficient time to recover. But the alarm rang, they had to go. So they went. Now, fortunately, the command people are you know, they're experienced for the most part. They know what they're doing. Chief Krebsbach over there is an experienced guy, and before we ever marked on scene at that fire, that box was upgraded to a second alarm because he knew his guys were already worn out and they were dehydrated, and one of the ways that he could compensate for that was increase his manpower and rotate people faster. So if you're in a command situation, it's not just worrying about yourself and these aspects of it. One of the things you have to do is worry about all those people under your command. And so those people, most of those people have learned by experience that, hey, it's, you know, the heat index now is 105. We've already had one working fire today where we were first due and did a lot of work. These guys are dehydrated, they're tired, we're working in wet gear. We need to get them some help, and so they come in instead of being in the fire for a 20-minute period of time, now maybe they're in there for 10 minutes and they rotate them out. So they went through this process again. A little bit worse on that second, okay? But they got it done. They started this process. They came back to the house. They fixed their lunch. They ate their lunch. They started rehydrating. Almost everybody was asleep in a recliner, and at 3 o'clock they got another one. Okay, now the heat index is 115. Again, I think they were second in behind 22s on that fire. Another multiple alarm apartment fire. Okay, and it just got to be a very nasty thing. And so when we were getting ready to get done, I told Rick, Captain Van Zant, who's the house captain at 22s, I said, tell your people, you know, tell your officers not to be in a big hurry to mark back in service. Give them a break. Let them get some fluids in them. Let them recover a little bit. I mean, you can't delay it very long, but, 10, 15 minutes makes a big deal. Okay? He looked at me like I was nuts, which is not uncommon for Rick when I talked to him. But the point is that I wanted to make them aware that even though they had a couple hours between those events, it was not a sufficient time for their people to recover. And every time they rolled out of that house in a dehydrated state, they were putting themselves in trouble.